I'm going to think with you this morning about about mystery as a spiritual practice. And if you pull up a list of spiritual practices, you will not find mystery on the list, and not on any that I've ever run across anyway. So like I say, it's an experiment, but it's Visa's fault if somebody needs to be blamed for it. When she spoke the other week about solitude and silence, she got me thinking about this and thinking that maybe it ought to be something that we consider in this way. Now, of course, anytime you're seriously digging into an idea, and especially an unfamiliar one, you always want to begin by defining your terms. And so first, we need to remind ourselves, and I'm going to, no, this is not going to work either. Just toss it there. I'll have to remember it. It's the ADD. We'll just blame that. But we need to remind ourselves, and I'm going to rephrase Emily here a bit. Spiritual practices are not law, but grace. Not requirement, but gift. They are not things we do because we have to, or to get some sort of response from God. They are things we have been set free to do because of what God has done for us and is doing in us. So that's the first thing. Second, mystery. And as I hope you started to see with the passages that have been read this morning, mystery is not a secret God is unwilling to tell, or something too obscure or difficult for us to understand. Nor is it something we have to figure out. If your intuitive understanding of mystery has been shaped by Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, that you kind of, like mine has, you kind of need to set that aside. When the Bible talks about mystery, it's not something we have to figure out. It's something that on our own we could never figure out. It's something that's too big to be seen by the unaided eye, fully comprehended by the human mind, or defined and circumscribed by the human capacity for reason. It's something that has to be revealed to us by God. And the word mystery is almost always used in Scripture to describe the plan of God for the world, which he only shares with his people. And there's only one exception to that I can think of, and that's the passage that we read this morning from 2 Thessalonians about the mystery of sin, which certainly underscores the aspect of mystery because nobody can really agree on what it means, but there's at least one thing very clear in what Paul is writing here, which is that we cannot fully understand or explain God's solution for this world because we can't fully understand or explain the problem either. The wrongness of this world is too great and too fundamental to our experience for us to be able to stand apart from it and make sense of it. Philosophers and theologians argue a lot about the problem of evil, and the reason ultimately that evil is a problem is because we can't solve it, because it's simply something that we can't get our minds even free of, let alone around. The problem is a mystery to us, and so therefore must the solution be. Now, when I put these two words together, these two terms together, it's pretty obvious why they aren't routinely combined. When we think of spiritual practices, we think of things that we do, and mystery is not something we do. But here's the thing, and part of what I realized when Visa was speaking, neither are solitude and silence, which are by anyone's measure fundamental spiritual practices. They aren't things we do, they're things that we seek out, to which we yield ourselves and open ourselves. The practice that is involved is in learning to receive them and then ultimately to pursue them. They're not matters of doing, they're matters of accepting and letting God do. Because, fundamentally, they are matters of our surrender, practicing our surrender to God. Because other people are our chief defense against God, distracting us, occupying our attention, filling us with all sorts of stuff, good or bad, turning our minds and our thoughts away from God, arguing with him, giving us reasons to resist, reasons to be mad, or simply reasons to just not be there, creating all sorts of mental static and emotional static. To accept solitude is to shut down that defense. And similarly, words are our greatest weapon against God, both directly in terms of arguing with him and in all kinds of indirect ways. Keeping silence is laying down that weapon. Solitude and silence are external states of being. They're realities in the world around us which are necessary for certain things to happen in our own hearts. Solitude makes it at the very least far, far easier for us to be alone with and before God. And silence around us is necessary for us to find silence within us, for us to silence ourselves. And in a similar way, divine mystery is an external reality which we need to allow ourselves to experience without trying to explain it or explain it away. Mystery moves us into the deeps where we cannot stand, where we are not in control. And there's two halves to this. The first is acknowledging and accepting that we are in way over our heads. And the second part is trust. Not necessarily as an emotion, but as an action. Because very often, as my supervisor in clinical pastoral education told me, we have to choose to act in trust whether we feel it or not. Choosing to act in trust that even though we cannot keep our heads above water, God is the water, and he will not let us drown. John, do you have that Psalm 131? In David's lovely image, it is to sit with God like a weaned child in mama's lap. Something that Caroline is needing to wait to experience, among others that we know. A child which no longer sees that lap as a place to turn and get something, but simply as a place to rest and be at peace. So then, you can go ahead and shut that down. What does this mean for us? We live in a scientific age, which means an age of understanding in a very particular sort of way. It means an age of take it apart and name the pieces and figure out how to put it back together again and define the rules so that you can go out and make something else. One of the beliefs that drives and forms our culture is that we are able to understand how and why everything happens. That given enough time, we will get there. And that we have the right to expect that degree of understanding. And along with it, the degree that that brings of control over ourselves, our circumstances, and our world. Increasingly, our culture sees everything, including human beings and human lives, as just so much raw material to be cataloged, priced, and shaped however people choose to shape it. And the mystery of God runs completely counter to this world's expectations. Not because we cannot understand it. We can in the essentials, though certainly there are always going to be aspects of it that are too great for us to fully comprehend. Not because we cannot understand it, but because, and this is what offends the ego of humanity, it is not subject to our understanding. We aren't in control. We don't set the terms. And whether we like it or not is immaterial. God does not ask our opinion before he is who he is. Listen sometime to the arguments that rage through our culture with this ear, listening for how often those arguments boil down to, I don't want to believe that. But don't do it for very long, because you will very quickly get depressed, because the frequency is distressingly high. And what mystery calls us to, what practicing mystery, giving ourselves over to the mystery of God as followers of Jesus is to set that expectation, that mindset aside. It is to surrender the demand, even the expectation, that God will work in ways that fully make sense to us in our terms in this life. It is to accept fundamentally that, as no one has ever put it better than C.S. Lewis, he's not a tame lion. And to really think about what that means, that we're in the lion's cage. And in fact, that what we thought was a cage isn't. And that's hard. That's hard. Because all of a sudden we turn around and we look at all the things that can go wrong and all the things that can hurt, and realize that we're not promised that it's not going to happen to us. Yeah, we're not promised that God is going to keep that from us. And there's more to it than that even, because certainly, there are many in the church, many in this congregation, who have learned to accept that, yes, God allows things to happen to us that we can't understand right now. Who recognize and confess the biblical truth that God uses pain and suffering and difficult circumstances to do his work in our hearts. C.S. Lewis, again, put it very well when he said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain. But even when we recognize that, even when we present that as part of the Christian life, how do we justify it? How do we present it as something that we can accept? It dawned on me a few years ago. I've heard a lot of those testimonies over the years, and they all seem to end the same way. Bad things, whatever. And it comes to this, and now, because of all that terrible stuff, I'm in this place, which makes it all worth it. We justify God allowing us to suffer and allowing us to struggle and allowing us to fail on the basis that those are simply plot points which lead us to the success and the victory and the pleasures that we want. We say, and I've done this myself many times, and there are sermons I go back and kick myself for sometimes, that the rough and the rocky road is worth it because it leads to a beautiful place. And many times, yes, it does. But what do we do when it doesn't? Because if we're honest, sometimes it doesn't. We are not promised resolution in this life. We're promised a happy ending, yes, but not in this world. Go back and look at the book of Revelation if you don't believe me. And opening ourselves to the reality of divine mystery gives us a very different perspective. It teaches us to live between, in the open and the unresolved. Not backwards into the past, where everything is stable and unmoving. Not forwards into the future, where we can imagine everything being the way we want it to be. But right now, in the chaos of the unfinished, the undetermined, the uninspiring, and the unknown. And that's the only way we can learn to see Jesus in the chaotic now, which, in truth, is the only way we can learn to see him at all. Because that's where he is. That's where he's present. That's where he's working. Down with us in the muck and the mess of our lives. Sadly, life does not magically resolve itself. And as much as we might wish otherwise, God doesn't promise that it will. There are situations that never get better, and wounds that never heal, and sins that never stop kicking our butts. The wicked still prosper. And those we love and value and need get sick and die. And the next person I see rise from the dead will be the first. We ask God, we go down on our knees and we beg and we plead and we cry out and we scream to high heaven for him to do things that we know he can do. And we believe it would please him to do. To heal his children. To save those we love who have rejected him. To bring judgment down on the wicked. And everything in Scripture says this is his character and this is his will. And that this is his power. And we ask and trust. And sometimes he does. But if you've been reading the newspapers lately, you have to admit it's rather more often that he doesn't. And to the extent that our faith depends on God making sense to us, it's going to have a really hard time with the evening news. Because he doesn't promise to make sense to us. He's on about something far too big for that. And one of the glories of this congregation is its historic focus on the affirmation that God is bigger. And we need to keep coming back to that over and over and over, because it's one thing to know that in your head, and it's something else quite again to have the ramifications of it driven deep into your heart. To sit in the mystery of God is to open our hearts to that reality. To be confounded and overwhelmed by God and just sit there without trying to make sense of it. Because making sense of things means making them small enough to come under the authority of our own reason. It means subjecting them to ourselves as judges of what sense can possibly be. Tim Keller talks about this, and not in quite these words. In a recent essay in The Atlantic, it just went up on their website a few days ago, on how he responded to being diagnosed about a year ago with pancreatic cancer. And at one point in the essay, he says this: "When I got my cancer diagnosis, I had to look not only at my professed beliefs, but also at my actual understanding of God. Had I been slipping unconsciously into the supposition that God lived for me rather than I for him? That life should go well for me? That I knew better than God does how things should go?" The answer was yes, to some degree. I found that to embrace God's greatness, to say, "Thy will be done," was painful at first, and then, perhaps counterintuitively, profoundly liberating. To assume that God is as small and finite as we are may feel freeing, but it offers no remedy for anger. It's an excellent piece. I encourage you to look it up and read all of it. I want to really highlight this morning 3 practices that he talks about, which have helped him open himself up, again, my words, not his, to the mystery of God's work in his cancer. The first, he says, was to immerse myself in the Psalms, to be sure I wasn't encountering a God I had made up myself. Any God I make up will be less troubling and offensive, to be sure, but then how can such a God contradict me when my heart says there's no hope or that I'm worthless? The Psalms show me a God maddening in his complexity, but this difficult deity comes across as a real being, not one any human would have conjured. The second discipline was something that earlier writers like Jonathan Edwards called spiritual soliloquy. You see it in Psalms 42 and 103, where the psalmist says, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." The authors are addressing neither God nor their readers, but their own souls, themselves. They're not so much listening to their hearts as talking to them. They are interrogating them and reminding them about God. They are taking truths about God and pressing them down deep into their hearts until they catch fire there. I had to look hard at my deepest trusts, my strongest loves and fears, and bring them into contact with God. And the third practice that Dr. Keller mentions is of focusing his mind and heart on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and really framing his life with that. And to that end, there's a prayer that he prays daily that he includes in his article. And John, if you'd put that up. "And as I lay down in sleep and rose this morning by your grace, keep me in the joyful, lively remembrance that whatever happens, final rising, because Jesus Christ lay down in death for me and rose for my justification." You put it that way, and maybe it doesn't exactly make sense, but you can feel how it's right. And practicing that focus, practicing that spiritual orientation, remembering that truth, does 2 things. One, it reminds us that even when nothing seems right and nothing makes sense to us, Jesus is present and at work in us and beside us. You've heard me before cite Hebrews 2. It's one of my touchstone passages. as the author of Hebrews builds this great crescendo about all things having been put in subjection under Jesus' feet, and then says, yet at present we do not see all things subject to him, but we see Jesus. Where do we see him? We see Jesus in the cancer clinic, standing beside the graveside, walking the halls of the hospital, of the nursing home. We see him in the foxholes with the frightened. We see him beside those who are utterly terrified. We see him keeping company with the lost and the alone, supporting the hungry and the thirsty. We see him with the prisoner, but with the criminal and the oppressed. And if we remember who he was when he lived and how he died, we can learn to see that. And if we remember that death did not have the final word, it reminds us that no matter how much life may look like defeat, the final victory is already won. And I would add one thing very simple to the disciplines that Dr. Keller mentions. Very simple, but profoundly terrifying, as most dangerous prayers really ought to be if we're thinking about what we're saying, which is simply asking God to open us to himself. One of the few prayers that really always does seem, in my experience, to be answered in the affirmative is one that we will be praying in a few minutes. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Take me deeper than my feet can ever wander. Don't pray it if you don't mean it. But don't shy away from it either. Dr. Keller testifies that he has found comfort and joy in moving into the mystery of God. And I can say the same thing. I mean, I'm not sure I could go as far as he does and say that I have never been happier in my life, but then I don't have his grief either, or his spiritual maturity, I expect. But if God has been doing anything in my life through this long Lent, 6 years and counting, he's been teaching me to live in the deeps and to find him there. And I've often said, if you think praying is dangerous, one of the perils of preaching is that God will give you the virtue of your sermons. Watch out. And this is one area in which that's been true. I had a lot to say over the years about living by faith and about the mystery of God, about the reality that very often when we talk about living by faith in God, what we're actually doing is putting our faith in God to give us what we actually want to put our faith in so we can trust in that instead. It's not faith in God, it's faith in that God will give me that relationship or that job or whatever it might be. And given how often I talked about living by faith, I should not have been surprised when he decided to pitchfork me into the ocean, so I had to go do it. And anyone who's had to put up with me the last 6 years does not need me to tell you exactly how not fun that has been at times. And it's ended me up in a position where I don't really very often ask God for what I want, at least on a large scale, because what I really want would overthrow the laws of physics, and probably the laws of logic for that matter. I love you people. I don't want to leave you, but this is not how I ever wanted my life to go. And honestly, at this point, for my life to fit what I wanted, I would have to be living in 3 or 4 places at once. Either that or find some way for some sort of massive space fold, so that we could have about 3 states combined and 3 different communities on top of each other, or maybe 4 or 5. Actually, I wouldn't even take that one any further. I don't understand how God is using me or not. And to be honest, I don't really feel like that's ever going to change. I feel like he stuck me in a holding pattern over a hair and then forgot that I'm up here. Even if intellectually I know he never forgets anything. I'm glad I've been able to do some good anyway, for this congregation, now for Habitat.